Coming soon. Jolting tales of horror. Creepshow.
The year is 1982, and horror legends George Romero and Stephen King are at the height of their powers. Romero is riding high off Dawn of the Dead. King's movie adaptations Carrie and The Shining did great business and were critically acclaimed. At this point, these two titans of horror already know each other. They met in 1976 at what would later be known as the Sundance Film Festival. They were put together by Warner Brothers because they had vampires in common. Romero had completed his oddball teenage vampire movie Martin, and King had just finished Salem's Lot. They hung out and became friends. King even cameoed in Romero's 1981 movie Night Riders.
They're like acrobats, that's all. They're like the wrestlers on TV.
Putting their heads together, Romero and King came up with a great idea: make an anthology horror movie in the style of EC Comics. For those who don't know, EC was a classic comic company in the late 40s and early to mid 50s that was predominantly known for its horror comics. Their grisly illustrations and dark humour made them a huge hit, but they were widely condemned as subversive and morally damaging to young readers. Eventually, the Comics Code Authority was introduced to regulate the comic industry, and EC had to sanitize their work. This led to them closing up shop as a comic publisher, although they continued to publish Mad magazine. For a further exploration of that story, read The 10-Cent Plague by David Haidu. But anyway, I digress. Back to Creepshow. 1950s American culture has always been a strong theme in King's work, and the late 70s, early 80s saw a heightened nostalgia for that period. So the idea to make a horror anthology influenced by 50s comics was inspired. Not that King and Romero were the first to think of it. There was already a boom in horror anthology films in the UK, where Amicus made them from the late 60s to the early 70s. But this project was a little different. In 1982, Creepshow was released, featuring 5 separate stories and a wraparound section that follows a kid called Billy and his nasty dad, as well as a truly disturbing puppet. The film adopts an eclectic and campy approach to the horror anthology genre. With its darkly humorous tone and use of comic art throughout, it excellently captures the feel of the original EC comics, making watching the film almost feel like reading one. Right down to the uneven quality, plot holes, and questionable dialogue. Let's dive a little deeper into the stories. In the wraparound segment, young Billy is told off by his dad for reading Creepshow. Dad says all sorts of nasty stuff about the comic and about people who like to read horror. Presumably King and Romero having fun at their own expense, as well as recalling common reactions to the comics at the time they were originally published. Billy is greeted by the creep at his window, throwing us into the world of Creepshow. There's 3 great cameos in this wraparound segment. Billy's dad, Stan, is Tom Atkins of Halloween 3 and Lethal Weapon fame. The garbage man at the end is effects legend and frequent Romero collaborator Tom Savini, and Billy himself is a very young Joe King, now better known as Joe Hill, the writer of Lock and Key, Nosferatu, and a fair few more. He is, of course, also Stephen King's son. The comic that Billy is reading in this sequence is an excellent facsimile of real EC Comics art. And no wonder, it's drawn by Jack Kamen, an artist who did many covers for EC. In the first segment, Father's Day, an evil father murdered by his own daughter comes back from the grave to get his Father's Day cake, and also, of course, some bloody revenge. In The Lonesome Death of Geordie Verrill, King hams his way through a riff on H.P. Lovecraft's The Colour Out of Space. He's the titular Geordie, a not terribly clever farmer who finds his property, and his body, overtaken by vegetation from outer space. In the third story, Something to Tide You Over, Leslie Nielsen puts in a shockingly nasty performance as a wronged husband who kills his young wife and her lover, only to face consequences from beyond the grave. Story number 4, The Crate, follows a mild-mannered professor browbeaten by his wife, who decides to take advantage of a horrible monster his friend finds hidden in the basement of their university. Last but not least, They're Creeping Up on You concerns a misanthropic germaphobe whose tightly sealed apartment is invaded by bugs. Like lots of anthology films, the standard of stories in Creepshow varies considerably. Father's Day is a slice of campy fun that slightly overstays its welcome, and the twist of they're creeping up on you is so obvious it's visible from space. The remaining 3 stories are excellent and play their hand very well. In Geordie Verrill's case, King's hammy yokel act is actually pretty charming. And the strange structure of the film, with its nested dream sequences and flashbacks, provides an interesting approach to horror. The end result is it turns surprisingly funny, distressing, heart-wrenching, and creepy. The relatively straightforward plot of Something to Tide You Over is turned into an electrifying, suspenseful short film that really hinges on the strong performances from the 3 leads. It's important to remember that Leslie Nielsen was better known as a dramatic actor at this point in his career, having only just completed Airplane 2 years previously. He's amazing here, playing a cold-blooded killer with great conviction. His chemistry with Ted Danson makes this a great watch.
Now do what I told you.
Like Father's Day, its ending is a little stretched out, but with great gross-out effects like this one, courtesy of Tom Savini, it's hard to argue that as much of a loss. Finally, The Crate is an amazing example of what I think of as a sideways adaptation. Despite being a completely original premise, in fact it wasn't created for Creepshow at all, but as a short story by King, it completely fits with the tone and atmosphere of the EC horror comics. It also has a great creature effect for the beast that lives in the crate, and an all-time best annoying character performance in Henry's perpetually drunk wife Wilma, played by the always excellent Adrienne Barbeau.
It's just as well. Buying real estate in a college town is a friggin' pain in the ass. You take my word for it.
It's in The Crate that Creepshow's promise pays off. A live-action, pulpy horror comic, played for camp laughs, cheap thrills, and with the most outrageous visuals possible. On release, Creepshow had a respectable showing, taking in $21 million for Warner Brothers, their highest grossing horror of the year. Critics mostly liked it, and you can say the same for its reputation amongst horror fans. For me personally, it makes a great start to an all-night horror marathon. A bit gross, a bit scary, a bit funny, and with enough cameos and cool effects to justify its sometimes slightly slow pace. At any rate, it did well enough to get a sequel with plenty of the same talent involved. And then, years later, another sequel with no one from the original. But we'll get to that in a bit. Join me in the next video to find out more about Creepshow 2. Thanks for watching my video about Creepshow, and I hope to see some great discussion in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. I'll be releasing more on Creepshow and other topics soon. Last but not least, indietrix is supported by a great community in the comments and a select few Patreon contributors. So if you're interested in supporting the channel, click the Patreon button or the link in the description to find out more.